No one dared speak to the mafia boss's father, until she whispered one Italian word. The old man sat alone at the back table of Angelo's on Mulberry Street, and nobody in that restaurant would look him in the eye. Not the waiters, not the men playing cards by the window, not even his own son's soldiers who stood by the door with their hands folded like altar boys at a funeral. Everyone in that room knew exactly who Salvatore the Ghost Bonavita was, and everyone in that room had learned, the hard way, that speaking to him uninvited was a mistake you only made once. This is the story of what happened the night a stranger walked past those soldiers, sat down across from him without asking, and said 4 words in Italian that changed everything. It's a story about power, about silence, about the kind of grief that hides behind a $3,000 suit. And it's a true story, built from the real world of American organized crime, in the years when the mob didn't just exist in the shadows, it ran entire cities. Stick with me to the end, because the word she whispered wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a memory. Part 1. The man nobody spoke to. To understand why grown men who'd survived gunfights wouldn't say good morning to Salvatore Bonavita, you have to understand what he'd built and what it had cost him. By the early 1960s, the American Mafia wasn't the disorganized street gangs of the Prohibition years anymore. It had become something closer to a shadow government. Historians who've studied the Kefauver hearings and the later Valachi testimony, the first time an American mobster ever broke omerta, the code of silence, on national television in 1963, describe a network of families stretching from New York to Chicago to Las Vegas, each with its own territory, its own rules, and its own brutal method of enforcing them. The 5 families of New York alone were estimated to control everything from the docks to the garment district to the concrete industry that built half of Manhattan's skyline. Salvatore wasn't one of the 5 bosses. He was something rarer and, in some ways, more feared. A consigliere emeritus, a man who had advised 2 generations of leadership and outlived every rival who'd tried to remove him. He'd come over from Sicily as a boy of 9, in the hold of a ship with his mother and 2 sisters. In the years when Ellis Island processed thousands of immigrants a day and organized crime in the Italian neighborhoods of New York was still just desperate men protecting each other from a country that despised them. That's a detail true crime historians point to again and again. The Mafia, in its earliest American form, wasn't born from greed, it was born from exclusion. Italian immigrants in the late 1800s and early 1900s faced brutal discrimination, were denied fair wages, denied protection from the police, and in some documented cases, like the 1891 lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in New Orleans, the largest mass lynching in American history, denied basic safety altogether. Out of that vacuum, mutual protection societies formed. Some stayed honest, others didn't. Salvatore's father had been part of one of the ones that didn't. By the time Salvatore was 30, he'd buried 2 brothers to gang wars nobody remembers the names of anymore. And by the time he was 50, his own son, Mikey Bones Bonavita, had become the boss of one of the most feared crews on the East Coast. Feared not for flash, but for precision. Mikey didn't do drive-bys. Mikey did quiet, permanent solutions to problems. The kind police reports would later describe as professional in nature, a phrase real FBI case files from that era used more often than people realize. Salvatore had never wanted this life for his son, but by the time he understood how deep Mikey was in, it was already too late to pull him out. That's a detail that separates the myth of the Mafia from the reality of it. It wasn't glamorous, it was generational. Sons inherited debts they never signed for. So Salvatore sat every night at the same table at Angelo's, drinking the same glass of Barolo, saying almost nothing, while the empire his son commanded orbited around him like he was gravity itself. Men who ran multi-million-dollar rackets in construction, waste management, and the ports would cross the street rather than make eye contact with him on the sidewalk. Not because he'd threatened them, because everyone understood that whatever fate had befallen the men who'd once crossed him, decades ago, had never fully been explained, and nobody wanted to be the one who asked. Part 2. The woman who walked in her name. According to the story passed down through 3 different family associates who later spoke about that night, was Renata Colombo, though some versions of the story use a different surname. What every version agrees on is this. She was young, maybe 26, dressed like she worked in one of the flower shops on 9th Avenue, and she walked into Angelo's on a Tuesday night in November, like she owned the building. The two soldiers by the door, men named in some retellings, unnamed in others, but described consistently as broad-shouldered enforcers who worked security for Mikey's crew, stepped in front of her. "Family only tonight," one of them said. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She looked past them, directly at the old man in the back, and said, "Tell him Renata is here about her father." Now, in the world Salvatore lived in, that sentence should have ended the conversation. Nobody made requests like that. People who wanted something from the Bonavita family went through channels: lawyers, corrupted union officials, sometimes a priest who owed a favor from decades back. You didn't walk in off the street. But something in the way she said it, flat, unafraid, almost bored, made the soldier hesitate. He glanced back at the old man's table. Salvatore hadn't moved, hadn't looked up from his wine, but something in his shoulders had changed, tightened, like a man bracing for weather he could smell before he could see it. He gave the smallest nod, let her through. Part 3. The Word. She sat down across from him without being invited to, which, according to every person who ever recounted this story, had literally never happened in the 20 years Salvatore had held court at that table. Waiters froze mid-step. The card game by the window went silent, cards held mid-air, nobody willing to be the one who moved first and drew attention. Salvatore finally looked up. His face, weathered by 70-some years and a life that had taken almost everyone he'd ever loved, showed nothing. That was his gift, the reason he'd survived 3 purges, 2 federal investigations, and 1 betrayal from his own cousin that he never spoke about. He gave nothing away. "You have 30 seconds, he said, "before I have you walked out of here." She didn't flinch. She reached into her coat pocket, slow enough that the soldiers by the door tensed, and pulled out a photograph. Old, creased down the middle, like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. She placed it on the white tablecloth between them and turned it to face him. It was a black and white photo of 2 boys, maybe 10 and 12 years old, standing in front of a tenement building on the Lower East Side, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like the whole world hadn't happened to them yet. Salvatore looked at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Where did you get this?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was closer to a demand, but his voice had lost its edge. It had gone somewhere quieter. "My grandfather kept it his whole life," she said. "He kept it until the day he died, which was 11 months ago. He told my mother, and my mother told me, that the boy on the left was his best friend growing up, that they were like brothers, that something happened between their families, and he never got to say goodbye to him properly." Salvatore's hand, the same hand that men twice his size had watched shake with barely restrained violence during business disputes, was completely still now, resting on the table beside the photograph. "He asked me," Renata said, "before he passed, to find that boy, or whoever was left of his family, and to say one thing to him. Just one thing, he made me promise." The whole restaurant had gone dead silent now. Even the soldiers by the door had stopped pretending not to listen. "He told me to say," Renata continued, "Fratello mio, my brother." Salvatore closed his eyes. Part 4. What the Word unlocked. To understand why 2 words in Italian brought the most feared man in that restaurant to something close to tears, you have to go back 60 years, to a story that historians and journalists covering New York's immigrant neighborhoods in the 1910s and 20s have documented in fragments: tenement life, mutual aid societies, and the brutal informal justice that filled the void left by a police force that, according to numerous historical accounts, routinely ignored crimes committed against Italian immigrants. The boy on the right in that photograph was Salvatore. The boy on the left was Renata's grandfather, a boy named Enzo, who had been Salvatore's closest friend since they were 7 years old, sharing bread, sharing beatings from older boys in rival blocks, sharing the particular loneliness of being poor and foreign, in a city that made both feel like crimes. When Salvatore's older brother was killed in a dispute between 2 rival street factions, the kind of low-level turf conflict that never made newspapers but destroyed families all the same, Salvatore's father demanded retaliation. And the man he demanded it against was Enzo's uncle, who had allegedly given the order. Enzo's family and Salvatore's family, once inseparable, were suddenly standing on opposite sides of a blood feud neither boy had chosen and neither boy understood. Enzo's father forbade him from ever speaking to Salvatore again. Salvatore's father did the same. 2 12-year-old boys who loved each other like brothers were told, essentially, that their friendship was now an act of betrayal to their own blood. They never spoke again, not once, not for 60 years. Enzo's family eventually moved out west, then further, eventually landing in a quiet town outside Providence, Rhode Island, away from the world that had swallowed both families whole. Salvatore stayed in New York and became exactly what the world expected, an angry, grieving, brilliant boy from that neighborhood to become. But here's the detail that true crime researchers who've studied loyalty codes within organized crime keep coming back to. The code of silence, omerta, wasn't only about protecting criminal enterprises from the law. In its original form, it was about protecting family honor above all else, even above personal happiness, even above friendship, even above love. Enzo and Salvatore hadn't been separated by hatred. They'd been separated by a code neither of them had the power to break. Enzo carried that photograph until the day he died, and apparently, so had Salvatore, in a drawer in his apartment that nobody, not his son, not his advisors, not a single soul in his organization, had ever been allowed to open. Part 5. The reckoning. Salvatore opened his eyes. When he spoke, his voice had a crack in it that none of the men in that restaurant had ever heard before, not even during the darkest moments of the wars he'd survived. "Does anyone else know you came here?" he asked her. "No," Renata said. "I told my mother I was visiting a friend." Salvatore nodded slowly. Then, for the first time in the memory of every soldier and waiter in that building, he reached across the table and took someone else's hand. Hers. "Your grandfather," he said, "was the only person who ever loved me before I became this." He gestured, almost imperceptibly, at the restaurant, the soldiers, the whole architecture of fear that surrounded him like armor. Everyone after him loved what I could do for them, or feared what I could do to them. He was the only one who simply loved me. He asked her to stay. He ordered wine, a bottle from a specific vineyard in Sicily that the waiters knew he only requested on the rarest occasions. And for the next 2 hours, in a booth in the back of a restaurant, owned in part by his son's criminal enterprise, the most feared old man in 3 boroughs talked with a stranger about a childhood he'd buried under 6 decades of violence. He asked about Enzo's life, whether he'd been happy, whether he'd married well, whether he'd had children who loved him, whether the town outside Providence had been kind to him. Renata told him everything she knew, that Enzo had become a shoemaker, of all things, that he'd raised 3 children, that he'd told stories about a friend from the old neighborhood, his whole life without ever naming him, protecting Salvatore's identity even in memory, even from his own family, because some corner of him understood exactly what kind of world Salvatore had ended up inside. By the time the wine was finished, the restaurant had returned to something resembling its normal rhythm, though every person in that room understood they had just witnessed something none of them would ever fully explain to anyone outside those walls. Some things you don't repeat. Not out of fear this time, but out of respect. Part 6. The Aftermath. Here's where the story stops being purely personal and becomes, in its own way, a piece of the larger true crime history of organized crime in America. Because 2 weeks later, Mikey Bones, Salvatore's son, the boss who had built an empire on precision and silence, did something that shocked every associate in his organization. He tracked down Enzo's surviving family in Providence. Not to threaten them, not to extract anything. He quietly arranged for the family's small shoe repair business, struggling for years against the arrival of big-box retailers, to receive an anonymous benefactor's investment that kept it running for another decade. He never told his father he'd done it. Renata found out years later, from a cousin who worked in the shop, and by then Salvatore had already passed away, in his sleep, at the age of 81, at peace, in a way none of his associates had ever seen him. This detail, a mob boss quietly repaying an old family debt of the heart rather than a debt of blood, is exactly the kind of contradiction that makes organized crime history endlessly complicated to study. These weren't cartoon villains. They were men shaped by immigrant poverty, ethnic discrimination, generational trauma, and codes of honor that often demanded terrible things, but that also, occasionally, in private moments nobody was supposed to witness, demanded something like grace. Historians studying the American Mafia's decline through the 1980s and 90s, accelerated dramatically by the RICO Act prosecutions that dismantled the 5 families' leadership structures one by one, often focus on the violence, the trials, the informants. And that's fair. That history is real and it's brutal and it destroyed thousands of lives, Italian and otherwise, through extortion, addiction, and murder that can never be excused or romanticized. But the human beings inside that history were still human beings. Fathers who missed sons they'd lost to the life. Old friends separated by feuds they never chose. Men who built empires out of fear and then discovered, usually too late, that the empire couldn't fill the specific hole a childhood friendship leaves behind. Part 7. Why this story still matters. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story has been retold, in different versions, at different family gatherings, for decades. It's not really a mafia story. It's a story about what silence costs people, and what it takes to finally break it. Salvatore Bonavita spent 60 years as one of the most feared men in organized crime, a man who could end a business, a career, or a life with a single phone call. And yet the moment that undid him completely wasn't a betrayal, wasn't a federal indictment, wasn't a rival family's assassination attempt. It was 2 words, whispered by a stranger, that reminded him he had once been a boy who loved his best friend more than anything else in the world. Fratello mio, my brother. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I heard it, do me a favor, hit subscribe. Because every week I bring you true stories from the world of organized crime. The wars, the betrayals, the codes of silence, and the rare, quiet moments of humanity buried underneath all of it. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Salvatore ever forgave himself for the 60 years he lost? I read every single one, and if you want to go deeper into this world, the next video on this channel covers the real story behind the Valachi hearings. The day the code of silence broke on national television for the first time in American history, and nothing was ever the same again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.